Hello, and welcome to Western Civ, episode 304, The Grand Progress. Despite the Peace of Amboise, neither side in the French Civil War was completely disarmed. Catherine chose to continue on as though a universal peace had been declared. However, and as though the days of religious strife were in the rearview mirror, they weren't. Even mere days after Amboise, the Princess de Condé was attacked in her carriage. Condé himself was infuriated and believed that it had all been the work of the Guise faction. But for the moment, Catherine managed to calm him down. Her goal was to simply out-entertain the rival factions. She would put on so many magnificent balls and masks with so many beautiful young women that she would exhaust them all with frivolity. Before long, Catherine reasoned, these feudal lords, Huguenot and Catholic, would just forget what all the fuss had been about in the first place. These lavish entertainments quickly made Catherine's court notorious throughout Europe for its brilliance. Yet throughout it all, Catherine remained dressed in all black, still technically in mourning for her dead husband. She would have been very conspicuous in a court of so much color, and that was probably the point anyway. Catherine might not have had the physical looks of all the other women she kept around herself at court, but she wasn't without charm. Indeed, in the months after Amboise, even her critics forgot what they had been so angry about. Notwithstanding her efforts, Catherine's days still seemed to be spent answering complaints from both sides of the First War of Religion, each accusing each other of not observing the Peace of Amboise. To every complaint, she applied herself with calm determination to settle the disputes tactfully and, above all, expediently. She was so exacerbated by the continual protests from Cologne that she finally wrote to him stating that if the Protestants continued to agitate and break the law, she would retaliate, quote, without respect to persons, religion, or any other consideration but the peace of this state, end quote. Catherine was the arbitrator, but she was also indomitable in her task. The desire for vengeance, the inevitable fruit of civil war, seemed endemic. Contract murders were commonplace and acquired the nickname, quote, vengeance in the Italian manner, end quote. Finally, recognizing that drastic measures were required, the Queen Mother took a course of audacious political bravery. She decided she would have the 13-year-old king declared to be of age. Technically, as laid down in the past by Charles V, the legal age of majority for a king in France was 14. Catherine decided her son was close enough. She knew full well that a king was respected more than a regent, and doubtless hoped that this would cow the remaining difficult personalities at court into some form of submission. Catherine would, of course, continue to rule, however. The change would be purely cosmetic. So it was that on the 17th of August, 1563, Charles was declared the King of France. Parliament argued against the designation, but Catherine was insistent. In a document that she drafted for her son at this time, Catherine set out the 4 points that she believed essential to successful rule. The king must provide leadership and be accessible and central to all that happened at court. The key to harmony and to maintaining a grip on affairs was, quote, to restore the proper function of court, end quote. It must be the central attraction of French life and revolve around the king. She stressed the importance of a regular routine that ought to be kept by Her Majesty. Within this, priority must be given to public affairs, and the expectation of the nobles had to be fulfilled. Catherine also stressed her determination that the corruption of court officials had to be stamped out. Business had to be dealt with promptly and efficiently. Officials often let urgent affairs untended for weeks or months, adding to the impression that the king was a distant and uncaring figure. She insisted that Charles be personally available to all the people who came to present their grievances, writing, quote, take care to speak to them whenever they present themselves in your chamber. I saw this done in the day of your grandfather and your father, and when they had finished speaking about their business, they were encouraged to converse about their families and their personal matters. End quote. She also advised the king to keep a close hand on all questions of patronage. If he had a firm grasp of affairs relating to available offices, vacancies, and everything within his gift, he would control not only the court, but also the provinces, stamp out corruption against the crown, and win the people's loyalty at the same time. Here she cited the story of Louis XII, who had carried a list of vacant offices on him everywhere he went. Francis I paid key provincial figures to keep him abreast of vacancies and developments down to the very last detail. The provincial garrisons, whose importance Francis had consistently stressed, were not just for local defense, but also provided a useful, quote, chivalric center for local magnates dispensing the esprit de faire, the desire to make trouble. She told Charles that the care of the merchants and the bourgeoisie was now of more importance than ever before. This political testament doesn't address many important elements required for a successful ruler. It's not a Machiavellian text. There's no advice, for example, on finance or military matters at all. But it's believed that the original document had two parts and only one of these remains, so we can't be certain. But if you think about the magnificence of court and how she stresses the importance of patronage, you can see that we're just a hop, skip, and a jump from Louis XIV. Catherine had now effectively tied the Peace of Amboise to the king's coming of age. This riled the ultra-Catholic faction led by the Guise family, who now made a very dramatic return to court dressed in all black. They demanded that the Duke's murderer be brought to justice immediately, which of course would only have reignited the ongoing civil war. In January 1564, the king announced, however, that there would be no immediate judgment. Instead, the matter would simply be held over for 3 years. Clearly, the true author of this sage pronouncement was Catherine. Its purpose was obvious: punt the issue in the hopes that things simply calmed down in the interim. But in reality, little changed. Throughout January and February 1564, there were multiple attempts on the lives of the leaders of the various factions, and Catherine's life, though for the moment there was no further bloodshed. Unfortunately for Catherine, Charles really did not look the part of a majestic king. He was frail and anemic, but she did the best with what she had. And luckily for her, Charles at least loved hunting, a fond pastime of any masculine, noble male, so she had that to build upon. Like his late brother, Francis II, Charles seemed to lose himself in the frenzy of the hunt. Although he was weak and his health was often poor, he would push himself as hard as he could. Everyone noticed that he had difficulty catching his breath, and as the years passed, he grew weaker with each debilitating crisis, slowly becoming maddened in both body and mind. As time progressed, his rages became so violent that courtiers genuinely feared for their lives. Eventually, attacks of complete dementia would seize the king, but even now, at 13 years of age, an essentially kind and generous-hearted boy, he often found himself prey to occasional ungovernable outbursts of anger. Charles delighted in the chase, but showed an abnormal and morbid interest in the kill. On occasion, he even eviscerated his prey with his own hands. Now, Charles was, to his credit, a very talented artist as well as evidently novice butcher. He also spoke Latin, Greek, and, of course, his mother's fluent Italian. Charles was close to his family, though he had a rivalry with his younger brother, Edouard Alexandre. Note throughout history, Edouard Alexandre is referred to typically as Henri, Duke of Anjou. I'm going to do the same. Henri was less obsessed with the hunt than his brother, but quite masculine by standards of the day. Charles's sister, Margaret, enjoyed the best health of anyone in the family, though her mother certainly liked her the least. The youngest child, by the way, is still around, Hercules. He was clearly the proverbial runt of the litter. He was hideously deformed, and his legs were twisted such that he was only a little taller than a court dwarf. For those fans of Game of Thrones, he may well have been the inspiration for Tyrion Lannister. Ironically, Catherine had a fascination with dwarves, so there were plenty of them around to compare her son to. It had always been Catherine's dream to take her family on a grand tour of the realm, a grand progress. Now, with her son officially king, she decided this was the moment. The whole court, in all its majesty, would go on a visitation. Maybe, she hoped, seeing the new king and his court would quell the religious unrest that seemed to threaten to tear the kingdom apart even still. But the visitation had another purpose. She intended to personally meet with Philip II at the Spanish border, in the hopes of cementing a permanent alliance. Catherine placed the constable in overall charge of the royal progress, which left Paris for Fontainebleau on the 24th of January, 1564. They were not set to return until May 1566, nearly 2.5 years later. Several thousand members of the court and their servants made up the great royal progress. Among the essential members of the party were the king's council, in order that the government business could be conducted as they moved, and of course all the foreign ambassadors. Catherine hoped that the latter would report back to their various masters, describing the splendor of the train, thereby refuting the widely held view that France was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy. The royal household traveled with their usual attendants, ladies and gentlemen, including a flying squadron of girls, tutors, priests, 5 doctors, 5 kitchen officers, 5 sommeliers, cooks, musicians, porters, grooms, beaters for the hunt, and 9, of course, essential dwarves, who, of course, had their own miniature coaches. The number of horses and mules required to transport both people and luggage, particularly the gold-studded trunks of the royal family, was phenomenal. With them, the party carried everything, from furniture and cooking utensils to clothes and costumes for all the festivals, feasts, and masks that had been planned. Portable triumphal arches, which could be easily erected when needed, were also stowed, and elaborate royal barges for when the royal pageant took to the water. It was quite literally a city on the move. Catherine brought with her such diverse items as silk sheets, silver washbins, gold plate for banquets, her writing table, registers, papers, money, hats, and her lute and lyre. In bad weather, or when the need arose, she chose to travel either in horse-drawn litter or in a cumbersome coach drawn by 6 horses so that she could conduct state business in transit. The seats were lined with green velvet and cushions, and the children would often sit with her in this coach, so spacious that it resembled a small room. Unfortunately, these vast vehicles induced attacks of travel sickness that were anything but majestic. So, when weather and work permitted, the Queen Mother, who had 6 of her finest horses with her, would ride along with the rest of the nobles. Whenever possible, the royal family would travel by barge, travel by water being simply the easiest way to get around in this age. For protection, of course, there were 4 companies of soldiers, a company of light horse, and a unit of the French Guard, whose commander was Filippo Strozzi, a second cousin to the Queen Mother. As the procession began, it was joined by the Cardinal of Lorraine, freshly returned from the finally resolved Council of Trent. He brought with him the Tridentine Decrees, the rulings of the council, which today comprise what historians have dubbed the Counter-Reformation. The initial goal of Trent had been to forestall the Reformation. To that end, the decrees were just a tad too late, you might say. Catherine was determined to oppose the decrees. They would have largely removed the French crown's ability to manage the French church, and all those hard-won rights, hard-won over centuries, would revert instantly back to the papacy. Catherine deeply resented the papacy's attempts to enforce their rule over matters that were, in her opinion, strictly reserved to the crown. Her attitude hardened further when Jeanne d'Albert, Queen of Navarre, received a summons from Rome on a charge of heresy. Infuriated that Pope Pius IV dared to threaten a sovereign, and moreover one with actual land and property in France, Catherine replied that he had no license to rule over foreign princes, nor to dispose them of their properties. The entire concept was an anathema to the Queen Mother, for whom rights of the crown had become almost a religion to itself. She protected the Queen of Navarre, and Pius deemed it wise to leave the matter alone. Jean would later write gratefully, quote, "I put myself wholly under the wing of your powerful protection. I will go to find you wherever you may be, and shall kiss your feet more willingly than the Pope's." End quote. Finally, the progress set off in earnest on March the 13th, 1564. On March the 23rd, the court reached Troyes, where it remained for Easter, the Protestant members having to celebrate the holiday 4 leagues outside the city. Religion and the practice thereof continued to be such a problem that during the early months of the progress, so on June the 24th, a rather exacerbated Charles IX, probably through Catherine, ordered that no Protestant ceremonies except baptisms and marriages would be permitted for the duration of the tour. Protestantism was very much neither to be seen nor heard. That was how Charles was going to keep the peace. Catherine was determined to force this peace no matter what. In Lyon, she forced Protestant and Catholic members of court to walk side by side in a procession. "See, look, everyone's happy." That was the message. We have no record as to whether or not anyone believed this charade. We do know that shortly after the court left Lyon, plague struck the city and 20,000 people died. The Queen Mother then made a visit to Nostradamus, the famous astrologer, at Salon in Provence. It was an interview she probably looked forward to and dreaded at the same time. She had infinite respect for his predictions. Unfortunately, just before the royal party arrived at Salon d'Écran, there had been an outbreak of plague and most of the townspeople had fled. For Catherine, there was no question of avoiding the town or canceling the interview. Accordingly, Charles ordered that the people return to give their king a proper welcome or face punishment. The local population evidently feared royal ire more than the plague because they came back to watch their majesty's entry into the town. The royal family arrived in the mid-afternoon of the 17th of October. Charles was, quote, seated on an African horse with a harness of black velvet with large trimmings and fringes of gold. His person was robed in a cloak of Tyrian purple, adorned with silver ribbons. He wore an amethyst in one ear and a sapphire in the other, end quote. It was arranged that the Queen Mother would meet Nostradamus with no fuss or fanfare, and he suggested he, quote, move about and meet Her Majesty away from the vulgar people, end quote. Now suffering from gout, the aging Nostradamus walked up to the chateau to meet the King and Queen Mother. Moving slowly with a cane in one hand and his velvet cap in the other, he eventually presented to the royal party. After greeting the king properly in Latin, a long conversation ensued during which the prophet announced that Charles would not predecease the constable. This hardly gave cause for celebration because, Montmorency was already in his 70s. Catherine gave Nostradamus 200 écus and made him a royal counselor and the king's physician. This was not their first meeting. That had actually taken place in Blois back in 1560, where at Catherine's request, she had Nostradamus draw up Henri of Anjou's horoscope that predicted one day he would be king of France. The prophecy seemed to please the Queen Mother very much indeed. Less satisfactory was the interest Nostradamus had shown during his visit in a young page boy of the French king's suite. He insisted upon seeing the boy, who when called bolted in terror. The page was Henri of Navarre. The following morning, Nostradamus came back to see the young Henri of Navarre. This time he inspected the boy's body, and when he was done, he declared that Henri of Navarre would one day be king. This pleased Catherine a lot less. Now, from there the court proceeded to the Mediterranean, which Catherine adored. They saw orange trees for the first time, imported from China via Portugal. But then in December, bad news reached the entourage. There was, of course, trouble, and I mean religious trouble, back in Paris. Marshal de Montmorency, the constable's oldest son, had gotten into an argument with the Cardinal of Lorraine, who's of course Guise, and he was bringing troops to escort him into the city. As armed escorts were banned, The Marshal de Montmorency, who was also the governor of Paris, had been forced to use his own men than to try and split up the cardinal's troops. Hearing this, the Guise family had sent reinforcements to their brother, while, simultaneously, Coligny, a Protestant, ordered 500 soldiers to the capital to now counter the Guises' move. Now, after a time, Coligny's men left Paris peacefully, but a renewed outbreak of civil war was only narrowly averted. Marshal de Montmorency's swaggering and overbearing behavior had generally irritated almost everyone who mattered, and his bravado and abuse of power in the king's absence had been bound to cause trouble. Worrying news that Condé, another Protestant, was fortifying garrisons in Picardy also arrived to cause the Queen Mother much disquiet. To the astonishment of the Spanish ambassador, she refused to do anything other than send a few written reprimands and keep herself informed of further developments. But the biggest event of the tour was yet to take place: the meeting with Philip of Spain in June 1565. Now, Catherine knew full well that the Edict of Amboise disgusted Philip. Now, no one knows exactly why, but at some point, Philip decided that he was not going to meet Catherine in person. Now, generally, monarchs didn't meet face to face, and that might be why. Regardless as to the reason, though, Catherine was very disappointed. However, when she found out she would still be permitted to meet her daughter, then she was once more pleased. And so, on May the 3rd, the party left Bordeaux to meet Elizabeth at Bayonne. On May 8th at Montmarsan, Catherine heard, to her dismay, rumors that Philip had decided not to send Elizabeth after all. He was particularly displeased, having heard that Catherine had, while on the Mediterranean coast, received an emissary from the Sultan of Turkey. And he'd also learned from his spies that a French expedition to Florida was being organized by Catherine to sail from Dieppe. The Spanish felt fiercely protective of their New World discoveries, and they didn't like the threat of any other nation interfering in lands that they had been so happily plundering. Any last hopes that Catherine might have fostered of Philip attending the meeting had now died, though her daughter finally received permission to meet her mother after all. Unfortunately, Philip had also decided to send the severe and ferocious Duke of Alba, the same guy who's going to be sent to tame the Netherlands, as his personal representative. He hoped that Alba would talk some sense into the Queen Mother about the three issues that irritated him: conversations with the Turk, concessions to French Protestants, and, of course, land claims in Florida. 3 weeks later, on the 30th of May, while the court remained in place, Catherine set off for Bayonne incognito. She needed time to prepare for her daughter's arrival, which had been arranged for the 14th of June. The meeting between mother and daughter was extremely touching by all accounts. Philip demanded that his wife not be, quote-unquote, infected by heretics, so Condé was not permitted anywhere near the meeting. The heat was also so intense that several people fainted from exhaustion, but that was really the only hiccup. Catherine found Elizabeth much changed since leaving her mother in 1559. Her daughter had become more Spanish than French and had acquired many of the elaborate formalities of her adopted land. When she spoke, it was with the words of her husband, whom she loved, and years of indoctrination by an older man, who at last had found true happiness, it seems, with Elizabeth, his third wife. And that brought her uninformed, at least that's what Philip would have said, mind to think as he did. Thus, after a few first impulsive embraces and displays of tenderness, Elizabeth suddenly became more formal and restrained. Though they tried to recapture them, the easiness of their former days was just gone. Elizabeth had become Philip's mouthpiece for all practical purposes, and after a long and futile effort, begging her mother to see reason, she received a quick response from Catherine. Quote, "So your husband, Philip, suspects me? Do you know that his suspicions will lead us straight to war?" End quote. Elizabeth replied, "What makes you suppose, madame, that the king suspects your majesty?" To this, the Queen Mother remarked, how Spanish you have become, my daughter." Now, in addition to Elizabeth and Alba, Philip had taken trouble to replace his ambassador to France, Chantonnet, for Francis's Duke of Alva. He hoped that by removing Chantonnet, whose relationship with Catherine had often been less cordial and marked by his frequent reproaches, veiled threats and supports for the Protestants, this new man might help bring Catherine firmly back into the Catholic camp. Of course, one of the key reasons that Catherine had wanted this meeting in the first place was that she wanted to promote further marriages between the House of Valois and the Habsburgs. Alba, who had no experience dealing with a woman, especially one who employed every device and artifice to flatter and cajole him, found himself kind of out of sorts. Her naive belief in the power of dynastic unions, and some might say a fundamentally bourgeoisie desire to see her younger children well married, were not at all what the Duke of Alba was expecting. The old idea, of a union between Margot and the insane Don Carlos was resurrected, and then Catherine enthusiastically suggested a new proposal, that Henri of Anjou should be married to Juana, Dowager Queen of Portugal and Philip's sister. The fact that Juana was twice Henri's age, and Don Carlos also was a homicidal maniac shortly to be locked in a cell, didn't worry Catherine in the slightest. Off his guard and just not familiar with having marriage discussions, Alba steadily grew gruff, soldierly, and distant in all the meetings. In each ensuing talk, he did his best to keep the conversation focused on religion, specifically Catherine's policy of religious toleration, which of course Philip despised. He even hinted at one point that if Catherine could not contain the growth of heresy within her own realm, then Philip would have to step in and do it for her. Clearly, this was a veiled threat of war. Catherine was unmoved. She did not believe a new wave of persecution would solve her problems. Indeed, as Alba was about to find out for himself in the Netherlands, persecution is rarely a path to peace. Finally, exasperated, the Duke gave up trying to convince Catherine otherwise. Now, as an aside, Charles was present for this meeting with his sister, but he took no part at all in the serious negotiations. This was still very much Catherine's show to run. In the end, the meetings solved nothing. Spain was as distrustful of Catherine and France as ever. Catherine had agreed to nothing on the religious front, so for the Spanish, the whole affair had been a waste of time. On July 2nd, 1565, Catherine left. She would never see her daughter again. Catherine, for her part, felt the meeting had been a modest success, because even if it had resolved nothing, neither had it made the situation worse. But the Huguenots at court didn't see it that way. They had been effectively banished. Plus, Catherine had fraternized with Alba, who they hated. Years later, they would point to this meeting as a time when the seeds of future deadly conflict were sown. The biggest problem is that Catherine's policy of toleration had only in the end made both sides distrustful of her and gained her no firm allies. She had tried to chart this middle course, and she had now found herself essentially alone on a boat. From the Spanish border, the procession now slowly made its way home. On January the 6th, 1566, news of terrible atrocities arrived from Florida, where Spanish colonists had massacred the newly arrived, mainly French Protestant colonists. The French had actually reached the new territory first and claimed it in the name of their king, but they had reckoned without Philip's fury that there should be a colony of French heretics anywhere even remotely close to Spanish territory. He had sent a force of 26,000 men who attacked the 600 settlers, which is a little bit of being outnumbered, and 4 companies of French soldiers in a fury of bloodletting. Most of the settlers, men, women, and children, had their throats cut. Only a handful managed to escape. The French court was aghast when it heard the news. In the end, however, Catherine was powerless to avenge the killings. At long last, on the 1st of May, 1566, after 829 days, the royal tour arrived back in Paris. Catherine saw this as an epic personal triumph. To some extent, it was. But beneath the veneer of cooperation, the restive passions of religion continued to ferment. And as we will see next week, conflict loomed ominously on the horizon. If you've enjoyed the show, feel free to check out all the links in the show notes. I have a link there to Western Civ 2.0. It's the best way to support the show and gain access to early editions of every single one of the episodes you're presently listening to, except without the ads, as well as additional content. And if you'd like to support the show but don't have the few shekels to throw our way, that's fine. Just consider giving a rating or review however you're listening to the show, because it does help people find us.